When you're drawing with an eraser, it's important to have a good sharp edge. Now, they sell eraser pencils with really, really fine tips, and it's wonderful if you have one of those. I don't right now, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to very carefully take my used white vinyl eraser and I'm going to cut two angles. And those angles, it's kind of feels like you're cutting cheese, like cheddar cheese or something. But those two angles, what they're going to do is you're going to form like a little house kind of shape and like a really, really super steep roof. So you're going to have two angles just like that. And that will enable you to erase very fine, very clean straight lines. Now, also, when you cut off the little pieces, if you cut them big enough, you can also use those really sharp edges right there to erase some fine lines. When you're working with a kneaded eraser, the reason it's called kneaded is that's how you clean it. So kneaded is spelled K-N-E-A-D-E-D, as opposed to you need a kneaded eraser, which would be N-E-E-D. Yeah, so you need a kneaded eraser. And when you knead it, not only is this like a wonderful stress reducing activity, but it serves a purpose. So what you're doing is you're cleaning your eraser. All right, once you clean it, then you can make it into little shapes. Now, I'm not really talking about making it into sculptures right now, although you could do that if you want. But you can make it into like a wedge kind of shape. So this is very similar to what I showed you with the white vinyl eraser, cutting it. Now, using a kneaded eraser, it's always going to give you a softer erasure mark, and the white vinyl will give you a cleaner, crisper line. So you can, make this into like a wedge-like shape. You can also make it into kind of a pointy shape, if you need a point. Okay. After I finished my last video, I had some time and I stepped back and I really studied what I did. And what I discovered was I needed to adjust some of the values. I needed to make the floor and back of Arlo on the very top there darker. And then right now I used an eraser to make some of his hair tufts. And now I'm going a little bit darker. I believe I might be using like a 3B pencil, kind of lightly, to define some of the tufts of hair at the outer edges there, and also just to darken up that background. Now, I did make the decision not to put that really dark black shape back there because I felt like it wouldn't look right in the drawing. Here I'm using a kneaded eraser to erase some of the hair on the edges because I want the edges of Arlo to look nice and soft. Then I was just working in some of the negative spaces between the hair tufts. In this area, it was a little bit tricky because I had to decide what's going to be lighter here. Will the hair be lighter or the background be lighter? So there's a transitional area in there. Now the hair is obviously a lot lighter on the top of Arlo's head, but if you look over on the right side of his head, you'll see that the hair gets quite a bit darker. So I'm redefining some of the tufts and of his hair, and looking at the curves, looking at the negative spaces. Then using my kneaded eraser to erase the lights as I need to. Now, what you'll notice when you're working on your animal, that there's going to be a lot of highlights on the fur or the feathers if you're drawing a bird. And so that's when drawing with your eraser really comes in. However, one of the most important things to do first is to establish your overall pattern of lights and shadow. So now I did get kind of sucked into working up some of the details around the hair on his face and darkening that whole area right in there. So in some ways, I would say the values always come first, and then the texture
and then detail work on top of that. And it could be sometimes when you work on the values and you have to adjust the values, make areas darker, you could maybe lose some of the initial drawing that you did. You just deal with that and you put it back on. Like for instance, the part I'm reworking here, when I erased the grid lines, I erased some of that, so I had to add that back in. Now I switched to a 4B pencil. I haven't really been using 6B pencils on this drawing yet. So I'm kind of restricting myself to 4Bs. I'm using a lot of 4B, using a lot of 3B when I go lighter. Now the only part, okay, so there I'm using a kneaded eraser to pick out some of the lights because I'd gotten a little bit too dark back there. And here I'm just doing a little more shading there for his whole hip area. I needed to shade a little bit there in the back of his head so that you can see the edge of his head. And here I'm just lifting up a few lights on his back leg there with the kneaded eraser. Okay, so I need to work back into this area, adding more of the, kind of the feathery kind of hair. Then I noticed the bandana was like way too light, so I'm going back into my drawing with the graphite powder and just kind of pushing that around. And I wanted to darken up that whole side of Arlo's face as well as kind of underneath his chin there. Just kind of smearing that all around, getting that darker, adjusting the values, as needed. Also noticed his chest needed to get darker, the side of his front leg there. And then I needed to add some more darks on that bunny. So working back, into it with the graphite powder and the soft watercolor brush. Okay, so now I grab my pencil again, and I want you to check out these really, really short little choppy strokes that I'm using to depict the short, fuzzy texture of the bunny. And I believe right there I'm using probably a 3B pencil because I wanted the marks to be fairly dark. There I'm just sharpening up, getting the eyes and the nose darker. I only see a portion of that one eye on top, like kind of a half moon shape. And I'm continuing to work with the texture of the bunny, and now I've got back into good old Arlo and I'm working with his chest hair. It's a really nice kind of swirl the chest hair there, and then okay, I'm gonna like fix the edge of the bandana and then work on some of those individual curls. So as I got that whole area darker, I smudged some of my original drawing. So right now I'm adding that back on there, darkening up the bottom lip again. I know that needs to get darker. Later in the video, I'm going to work on the face really close up for you to see what I'll do with the details there. So on that leg, I'm just adding in the darks, which are the spaces between the tufts of hair. And yep, decided to get that graphite powder back out there for the bunny just a little bit, then working on that texture. And again, check out those little short little strokes that I'm working on. And in this type of drawing, when you're working with texture, there's a lot of inventive mark making, and so you've got to feel free to do some experimenting and exploring. So I'm continuing to add just a little texture, and I grabbed a lighter pencil there because there's variation in the lights of the bunny, and I wanted to show that, and I wanted to show the texture on the lights of the bunny, so I'm using an HB pencil to add those textural lines there. And here I'm working back into some of the darker areas, so we've switched to a softer blacker pencil, and I'm using my white vinyl eraser that I cut into a wedge shape to add some of his fur. So I'm actually drawing with that eraser. Now here, I'm pulling out some of the lights of the tufts of his hair on his chest right in there, and then some on his front leg, which I sometimes call arms. I realize dogs don't have arms, but all right. Then what I noticed is I stood back, and remember, it's important to step back every once in a while, is I needed to fix that shape back there by dealing with the negative space. And I want that area to look really, really soft and fluffy. I don't want a hard edge anywhere. And here I'm just pulling out the lights on some of his fur on the side too. And again, using that wedge shape eraser to pull out the lights. And I decided, oh, it's got to get darker there, between the two front legs. So I'm working on that. And I'm, again, adding some of the darker spaces between the tufts of fur on his chest. There, I'm just adding a little bit more detail on the bunny, getting a little bit darker in there, and still working on that side of the leg, trying to get the value a little bit darker. I wanted the edge of that scarf sharper and clearer, so I'm working on that. Trying to get that shadow a little darker there. Just added back some of the pattern into that scarf that I shaded on top of, just to suggest that it has a little bit of pattern there. And then I found he has this dark area around the side of his mouth, his snout, that I wanted to get darker on. So what I'm doing here is I'm drawing into the shaded areas with my eraser, the eraser that I sharpened to a wedge kind of shape, and I'm picking out some of the tufts of his hair, and then I just used a tissue to get rid of the erasure crumbs. Now I'm going back in with a pencil, and this is probably a 2B or 3B pencil, just to refine some of the edges of those tufts of hair and to add in the shapes of the shadows between the tufts of hair. So again, the hair usually appears as lights because it's shiny, and then the light reflects on it, and then you have to look at the spaces. Think of the darks as the spaces between the hairs when you're working on the texture. Now I'm looking at some of the shading underneath his scarf on his neck, and I wanted to darken up a little bit of the fur under there, and then I'm just continuing working with those curls in his chest. And then I'm working up the darks between his two front legs there. And I'm coming back in with my kneaded eraser, and you'll see me with my hand like playing around with it while I keep shaping it back into like a wedge kind of shape. And now I'm going back with a pencil and kind of cleaning that area up. Darkening up the scarf. So really, I continue to adjust the values as I go along. It's a kind of a continual process of refinement until the end of the drawing. And that's really, I hope that's what you take away from the class, because that's what drawing is. It's a series of refinements or adjustments, along the way. It's kind of like how you would, write an essay. It's just revision after revision after revision. And each time you go back into the drawing, you usually see something new, something you didn't see before. Sometimes as you work on a drawing, you might get too dark or you might get too light, and then you have to fix that too. So getting darker there, where his front legs meet his chest. It's really quite dark in there. Then I want to add some of those little tufts of fur. They almost look like feathers up in there in the chest area. Wiping off the erasure crumbs. Now I'm just, again, going back with the pencil and refining what I just erased. So you can see what I'm doing. I'm going in with the eraser, erasing the lights, and then going back with the pencil and adding in the shadows between the tufts of hair. So on that leg, I saw kind of this, just a part of the hair, and there's like a shadow in there, so I wanted to darken that up. And now I'm back with that kneaded eraser, adding in some of the lights. So I'm just kind of revising that whole area. Now I'm starting to work on all my final adjustments to the face. You know, I started with the face. I started drawing the face. I blocked in the face first. That's my focal point. But then I left it until I dealt with everything else in my drawing to refine it at this stage of my drawing at the end. So I kind of left it. It's a lot of fun to do. So right now, obviously I had to get that nose a lot darker. I always think like dogs' noses look like black gumdrops. You know those candies, gumdrops? Anyway, I always thought noses look like that. Then he has a little part. His hair like goes on different directions on the top bridge of his nose. Now I'm working on, that area surrounding his nose, and I see some shadows there. There's a clump of hair that kind of flops over, so I'm putting some shadows in that and refining some of those edges. So because my face is the focal point, I'm going to put the most detail into that. I'm going to spend the most time with that. Now I'm working on the little black lip that he has, and he's got his tongue sticking out there and a couple of teeth, so I'm working on that area right there and adding some darks on either side of his snout, adding some more, detail with some of the hair. And I realized that whole area there is a little darker. The tongue has some shadow on it. The left side is shaded a little darker than the right side. And just refining the little lip that I see. Adding shadow on the tongue. Then I notice that I've got to do more shading under his little chin, and that'll help define his chin. So then I see that, the light on that side of the face is really sort of at the top area right there, and I need to add some shadows around the eye. So I'm working up some of those shadows right there. Playing around with shadows on the other eye. And I see, just looking at the shape of the eye. And on the left side, I can actually see a little bit of his eyelid, too. And working on the hair that's growing out of the bridge of the nose, going in either direction. And I noticed that the other eye there needed to get darker. And then, yep, I got a little too dark, so I've got to come back with my eraser and erase the lights. And again, it's just a series of revisions. So I'm going to get that ear a little darker in there, get that side of the face darker, and I'm refining some of the tufts of hair, getting them a little bit more accurate. Erasing the lights again. Now, what I realized was with the other photo, I really couldn't see the eye on the right side at all. It was just like really black. And I needed to re-look at the photo, and I wanted to look at a photo without grids. So what I did with this photo was, of course, I lowered all the saturation so it would be just black and white. And then after that, I actually lowered the contrast. And I lowered the contrast so I could see more variation within the shadow. So now it's so much easier to see. Like, for instance, we know that the nose is really, really dark, but now you can see the light and shadow on it much, much better. So sometimes you need to do that. Sometimes, if you can't see what you need to see on the photo that you're using, you ought to go back to your original photo and make adjustments to that so it gives you the information you need. I decided I need to get a little darker, back of the head. Again, refining some of the tufts of hair in there. I saw that that whole area needed to get a little bit darker. And now I'm working on putting that tooth back in there because I felt like I couldn't really see that tooth, so I'm dealing with that, erasing the tooth. Of course, I erased part of the lip. I'll put that back in. So I really wanted that his bottom tooth to show, and there it is. Sometimes, if you see something and you have to kind of erase an area and then draw back into it and then fix it again, and that's just what drawing's like, Right now, just using my kneaded eraser in a wedge kind of shape to pick up some of the tufts of the hair. And then back again, this time with a 4B pencil and refining those tufts of hair after I erase them. Then I wanted to see what I'm doing with those two little tufts of hair there that are like curling around the end of his nose. I wanted those to pop out a little bit more, so I'm shading around the outside of those. And then I noticed that part of his nose, part of the snout needed to get a little darker. Need to go darker there, under the eye. And I'm adding more of the ones. After I was done, I worked about another half hour just refining the drawing till I was satisfied with it. So I hope you have fun working on your furry animal or your feathered friend.